By the way, when I look out at all of you, not just in this room, but visiting with others in other meeting rooms here, I say I almost get goosebumps when I think back to my own beginnings in this business. I began in my hometown of Kansas City many years ago, 1960s as a matter of fact, at my hometown newspaper, the Kansas City Star. And at that time, nobody was doing investigative reporting. Every once in a while, somebody would get an idea to go after a labor that had somehow gone off the rails. That was okay. There would be a politician or two who was varying what he should do, and they would look at that. But these were very hit and miss kinds of projects. I mean, the idea of looking at companies, the idea of looking at corporations, corporate power, absolutely unheard of. It wasn't that there was some rule at the paper, don't do this. It just was something you didn't do. It just didn't happen. So when Don Bartlett and I began working together in the 1970s, we both had similar experiences many places, and we began to find ourselves gravitating to stories of corporate abuse. We began covering such things as the international oil crisis back in the 1970s. We then delved into the machinations of a very weird duck by the name of Howard Hughes, who was influencing all kinds of things, governments at the federal and state level. We began to increasingly track the power of special interests having their way in Washington. They've always been there, but really from the 70s on, it's become more and more important. And I want to reiterate something Walt said. It's a repetition of something he said, but it can't be said too much. Never, one of the first lessons we learned back in the 70s, never underestimate what's written down. It's just astonishing what people do put in writing. And as part of this process, one of the acts that we began to look at in the 80s was the Tax Reform Act of 1986. Here was a law that was supposedly enacted to make the tax code fairer for everyone. But one night reading it, I came across a little provision which I want to read to you. By the way, before I read this, I need to do a little marketing. I don't have a product placement, but I've got something else. I have an elixir for you. I mean, everybody has trouble going to sleep, right? Every once in a while. I have something for you. It's non-organically toxic. It never fails. It works within a very few minutes, and it's not habit-forming. Take my word for it. It's called the tax code. And anybody who thinks this business is always exciting, this is the death of journalism education. They find out what Bartlett and I do from time to time. But anyway, reading this 1986 Act one night, came across this. There was a whole section repealing this outrageous tax shield down the U.S. Virgin Islands. And this was good language. This thing's bad, such and so forth. Well, here on page 545 of this thing, further evidence of how exciting we are, was this paragraph. And I'll circuit it. But it said, section above, in the case of any tax year, neither the United States nor the Virgin Islands shall impose an income tax on one or more corporations. I'm starting to go to sleep almost at this point, right? Stick with me. Which were formed in Delaware on or about March 6, 1981. Suddenly a shot of adrenaline comes through my body. And which have owned one or more office buildings in St. Thomas, United States Virgin Islands, for at least 5 years before enactment of this act. Oh. Well, anyway, continuing this reading on other nights, come to find out there were hundreds of these things in the act. So here was this act, supposedly ostensibly to make the tax code fair, packed with all these kinds of things. We eventually spent time unraveling that, trying to see who did it, who were the people behind this particular thing. Over the years, that has been the focus of an awful lot of the work we've done. It's been looked at specific cases, companies, powerful individuals who did things. But what I want to talk to you about briefly today is a project we've been involved in just the last couple of 3 years. Chuck and his remarkable operation at American University, the Investigative Reporting Workshop, has been so instrumental in providing assistance. We're not looking at one corporation, one person, one powerful individual. We're looking at something broader and almost vaguer. It's the whole question of economic elite in this country and the kinds of power they exert to change the laws, to change the regulations, to direct public policy, They have been remarkably successful over the last 3 decades. We have coming out next month a book called The Betrayal of the American Dream, which is kind of a reprise and review of many of the policies that date back for decades, which we covered in an earlier version that America went wrong. But this takes it forward and actually even goes backward. You look at the recent meltdown of the last few years of the banking community, the finance community. This is just the latest step in a whole series of things that have been happening for many, many years. And that's what we try to document. We try to go back and show how those things happen. Taxes, deregulation, trade policy, all of these things way back. And the consequences, of course, have been horrendous for Americans everywhere. Stagnant wages, jobs lost, insecurity, things of this sort. So in this book and in the project, which we posted any number of things on the website, we try to show how this happened, how it came about, and what the consequences will be. This has been a particularly challenging thing to do, and I'll tell you why. Because so much of journalism, so much of nonfiction writings tries to find the dramatic event that captures what's going on in this world. What would our perception be of the American Civil War if there had been no Gettysburg, if there had been no Antietam? What if there had just been a series of skirmishes, small battles, that ultimately added up to the same amount of carnage? That's sort of what the economic war against the middle class and average Americans has been like. It's very fragmented, but the end results have been every bit as dramatic and every bit as traumatic for so many people. Just a brief thing, because we're running out of time, on a couple of the tools we used. We use so many of the new things. I mean, Don and I make the point, in some ways, as crazy as our business is, I can go onto the internet at any time of day and night, go onto a bankruptcy case somewhere, look at the claims filed by creditors, many of them are individuals, workers who work for those companies. I can do that anywhere I have access to a computer. When we did America Went Wrong years ago, I spent long periods of time in Topeka, Kansas. Now, I have nothing against Topeka, Kansas, since I was born in Kansas, and I know all of those wonderful little cities, but think of the differences, how you can explore, how you can ask these questions, how you can fish in a way that was much harder in those days and much more expensive. So those tools are absolutely fabulous, what's on the web, what can open that. We used all of those. We had some significant database analysis showing what's happening to wages, earnings, median family income by various groups. But the thing I want to leave you with is ultimately, to me, the most important part of the project is something that's absolutely timeless in our business. And I think Sara made reference to this. It's simply going out and talking to people. I mean, this is always ultimately the heart of so much of our work. Because you not only get these powerful stories, you get these great profiles, but you really find out what's happening to people. And one of the great things about this project to us has been the collaboration with the workshops, because they have been able to supplement a lot of the interviews we've had and to give us all a much broader picture of the range and the extent of what's happening to people in this country. And the value of that is that it took me many years to realize that the best writing, the strongest writing, stems from strong reporting. The more you know something, the more willing you're going to want to express those conclusions. It's just a natural thing that flows out of what you've come to know. That's a lesson I learned long ago, and it's one I relearn every week. Thank you.
Before we go to the audience, and we'll take questions given that Penn State is kind of a major presence in Pennsylvania, and given that there's only 90 miles away from, or something like that, from your office, and given that you're a 2008 Penn State grad, what kind of pushback were you getting from powerful folks in Pennsylvania, to your editors or to you personally? I'm just fascinated about any backstories. There's people tweeting away out here, so have fun with it. Anyway, but just take a couple minutes and then we'll go out here.
Yeah, I because I think we expected a lot. I mean, really braced for it, and did not get as much as we expected to receive. When I was a reporter at the Center Daily Times, the local in-state college where Penn State is located, I did a story about the Nittany Lion mascot getting a DUI. And I got hate mail for at least 3 months. Consistently. And so when this came up, I thought, oh my God. However, it wasn't as bad as we expected. And we get some, we still do. I think it really peaked actually when Joe Paterno died. And so it wasn't so much about Jerry Sandusky, I realized, but a lot of people's passion was more about Paterno and his legacy. I can't say that we've gotten we haven't gotten anyone who's called us up and said, don't publish this, anyone of power. What we get is more subtle. And it's still noticeable, but it's in the form of press agents lying to us or what we feel is spiting us with information that seems to make its way around to anyone but us. But, we'll ask for something and they'll give it to someone else, stuff like that. But really, it hasn't been the kind of threat that I expected, so.
All right, questions from the audience. Feel free to pop away. Any panelist has anything to add or other points? Anyway, I mean, one of the problems with this subject is there's 120 or 30 panels here and 1,100 people, and this panel essentially is the theme of the entire conference. Everyone at every panel is talking about investigating power. I want to reiterate the comment that was so great Walt made about documents. I don't think journalists, with the possible exception of IRE members, but generally speaking, journalists don't use documents the way they should. And I do think the best journalists on planet Earth have this document fetish, where they have to find the documents. And I think it's very important, and I recommend it. And can you please identify yourself and fire away? Try to be brief, and we'll try to be brief. We'll try to get as many as we can.
Kirsten Adams, Wisconsin Reporter. I'm curious for Sara, this became such a huge story, and yet you said there were kind of bits and pieces early on that you knew to investigate. What was the bits and pieces? What did you see? What did you hear that made you think this is worth following?
It all started with just like another normal conversation with a source who said, Jerry Sandusky's been accused of this. But I started to, interestingly enough, that source called me back about 6 weeks later and said, hey, remember that tip I gave you? It's not true. And, I believed it because it was a reliable source. And so, then it was a couple months after that, he had a charity, a children's charity, and we covered their one annual fundraiser every year. So I go to this fundraiser, and where's Jerry Sandusky? He's always here. He's the show. He's the center of attention to these fundraisers. One person said to me, well, he has family issues. Okay. Another, I asked again, and the other person said he has health issues. So pieces like that. And by the end, when I was really able to devote 2 or 3 entire weeks to this, it was literally stringing pieces together, because what we were hearing was lots of different allegations or pieces of stories, and they were not all in one case, if you know what I mean. There were multiple accusers. So there was one point where we thought we had actually built what we thought was a story about an incident in a Penn State locker room shower. You go back and look at that now. It was really 3 incidents that had kind of meshed themselves together, and I realized that it was 3 accusers instead of 1, 3 separate times, because the dates were all slightly off. And initially I thought, well, people's memories are wrong, What's the difference between 2000 and 1998 or 1999 and 2001? And, well, it's a huge difference, But it took that kind of, so it was a lot of, I laugh because I often get accused of, batting my eyes to some cop, and they just handed me the file, you know. That's great, let them think that. It was really literally stringing together a lot of little pieces of the story and figuring out where each piece went and putting it together. So it was really painful in that respect.
Thanks. Next question.
Yeah, I'd like to make an observation or two and get your
And identify yourself.
Oh,
Sorry.
Mark Miller from Pittsfield, Massachusetts, former newspaper journalist and wire service reporter. One of the panelists talked about the incredible ability of people to lie, just the unbelievable ability to lie in different ways. And of course, this whole panel is about power, and so much of what's going on in the world is about power. And there's the journalism is the fourth estate, so-called, and there's another estate, namely religious people, the church. And the idea that M. Scott Peck, who was an ethicist and a religious person, wrote a book called The People of the Lie. And Walter Wink, who just died, so it was in the Times, wrote a series of books about power, and he was a theologian. And that one of the very few books to come out about 9/11 truth, questioning the conventional wisdom on it, is written by David Ray Griffin, who's a theology teacher at Claremont College. And yet, probably in this room, there aren't an awful lot of people who, are deeply religious, except to their work and their principles and that sort of thing, but not in a kind of a, you know what I'm saying. Anyway, what about that? What about that?
It's a great question. I think it's even deeper than Aristotle. And for that, does anyone want to take a stab? Because we could ask. There's another person in line too. It's up to you guys. I don't know what to say. Yeah, I would. I don't know what to say about that. It's pretty deep. Thank you, though. I appreciate the sentiment. Next.
I am Stacy Singer with the Palm Beach Post in Florida. Mr. Steele, I've been a great admirer of your work for a long, long time, and I would deeply value your advice on how regional newspapers like mine can look at the large businesses, wealthy players, important people in our community, and find out how they have manipulated the tax code. Where do we start, and can you work back from an individual? Thanks.
Everybody? Okay. Okay. I think you can hear me. It's always obviously hard if it's a private individual, unless they're somehow found themselves into tax court or there's some litigation. Litigation is always the first step that I always approach at all levels, federal, state, tax court, to see what's there. Sometimes within those documents will lead you to other things. If this company is private, that's always tricky, of course, but there's always, very often, some filings. I'm not sure what the corporate requirements are in Florida, though I know Florida historically has been one of the more open states, unlike the state where I've done a lot of my work over the years, Pennsylvania, which is one of the more closed states when it comes to corporate activity. So taxes are private, taxes are very hard to get at. You just have to try a number of those things that are around it to see if any kind of actions have been filed against that person at the regulatory level, state, federal, whatever their business is. I mean, obviously, if they were in television and media, got things through the FCC and so forth. Just whatever their particular field may be, you just try to see what might be there. Many years ago, we did a huge project on radioactive waste and its disposal. The entire failure of the country to deal with this. And one of the companies we looked at was one that was peddling low-level waste sites to unsuspecting communities. And we looked at the names of the people on the board of directors, addresses all over the country. It took a long time to do this. It turned out they were all the daughters and sons of the founder of the guy who was peddling the radioactive waste. So it's those age-old things. It just step by step, trying to see what's around it. And if there's no litigation, if there's nothing like that, sometimes you have luck. The tax court is a field that a lot of reporters are not aware of. And that docket is now publicly available online. And that's always something to look at, because if somebody has really been playing some games, chances are they're going to find themselves there, or at least they used to. The IRS has been so diminished over the last few years. There's not anywhere near as much of that, I don't believe, as there used to be. But I think that would be a starting point.
Last question.
Yeah, Marty Gottlieb, Bergen Record in New Jersey. It's great listening to all of you and looking at investigating power up on the screen, and it caused me to reflect that usually you think of like the golden era of muckraking and trust busting takes place. Woodward and Bernstein, president gets knocked off. Here, it seems like power is growing and growing and growing, despite the efforts of everybody in this room and despite your efforts. And I'm wondering how you reflect on that, whether, you know, we go through an economic cataclysm and Jamie Dimon comes to Washington and is ruling the roost, despite everything that a lot of people have done here through their whole careers. Does it give you pause? Is there something we should be doing we're not doing? Is this just another country from the country we looked at in those past years?
Florence, you want to jump in? Or anybody?
Actually, I want to make a final point, but not about that.
All right. Well, does anyone want to answer it? I have an observation. Unless
Yes.
You know, I came to Washington during the Watergate scandal, and a few years later was working for Carl Bernstein when he ran the ABC Washington Bureau briefly, and then ran the Center for Integrity. And I think power is actually more out of control now than it's been in my lifetime, both private sector and even public sector. That's a long conversation, but I think the best reporting about the Iraq War and the financial meltdown, for the most part, was in books, which is kind of fascinating. And that's a really deep cosmic question. One of the reasons we tried to do this project is looking at moments of truth in recent history, from the McCarthy era to the civil rights struggle, to the Vietnam War, to Watergate, to post 9/11 America, which is obviously now corporate power. You know, and if you play around with the site, you'll see. But I think right now is actually the most serious time, and for all kinds of obvious reasons, and they're too obvious to state. We have the Great Recession, as bad as the Depression almost, and a lost generation of folks trying to get jobs, powerful folks who got more powerful, more rich. We're conducting multitasking our wars now. We have them in several countries. Don't get me started. I actually think we have some serious issues here. You guys are welcome to chime in, and I apologize. Florence, it's not that I don't want to have more questions. It's that I think they shoot us at a certain time here. I think somewhere around. Florence, you had a final thought.
I'll make a brief point, and that is, I really do like men. I'm married, lots of male friends. I hope you understand that I was addressing a culture, a system that we're all victimized by. That we're all victimized by. My main hope was that you could see that even there are numerous